Here we go. Good evening.
Good evening.
Welcome to People's University, Ancient History. If you would please silence your cell phones, that would be great. Next Tuesday, February 7 at 5, no, not at 5, at 12 p.m. I have to go fix that now. Dangerfield Newbies Fight for Freedom with John Eric Gillot. He is an archivist here in Wheeling, and he's written a book about John Brown's raid. And Mr. Newby was a former slave who lived in Bridgeport, Ohio, and became part of the John Brown raiding party. So that'll be very interesting. Next Thursday, February 9 at 7 p.m., Rome. You have to say it like that. Rome. The period of the kings through the republic. Our friend Dr. DIENER will be back for that. And I have passed around the sign-in sheet. I see that it's back up here. If you'd like to go to the Carnegie with us in March, sign that, please. Okay. Dr. Laura Michelle DIENER has taught ancient and medieval history at Marshall University since 2008, where she has won several awards for teaching. She received her PhD in history from The Ohio State University and has studied at Vassar College, Newnham College, Cambridge, and most recently, Vermont College of Fine Arts. Here she is. Welcome her back, Dr. DIENER.
Hello. I missed you all. But I heard you had an amazing time with Nikki. She was raving about how you were such a good audience, that you listened so much more intently than her students, which is, I have no doubt that's true. I'm so glad that you got the chance to work with her and hear about her research. And she is the best person to teach you about the Bronze Age. But I'm very happy to be back. And we're going to be back in Egypt today. We're going to be everywhere, but the focus is Egypt. And I do want to say that tomorrow, my daughter and I are going to the National Geographic Museum to see the virtual immersion tour of Tutankhamun's tomb. So I'm very excited for that, and I will report back, definitely. And I'm looking forward, the next few weeks we're going to be focusing on Rome, which is one of my favorite areas, periods, times, everything of history to talk about. And I will have some personal pictures. I haven't been to Egypt. I want to go, but haven't been to Egypt personally, but I have been to Italy many times. So I will have some great photos for you. And hopefully everyone got a handout. Okay, excellent. And there's a lot of complicated genealogies and king lists. I figured it'd be easier for you to have it in front of you. But if you thought, the 18th dynasty of Egypt was complicated, wait till you get to the Ptolemies. So, there we go. Let's see. How do I expand this? I think I can just do slideshow from beginning. There you go. Thank you.
Let me fix it for you.
Oh. Sorry.
It's gone to presenter view.
I know. I know. I don't have to point out anything in detail.
There we go.
There you go. Thank you. So today we are going to end up in Egypt, but we're going to start off in Persia. And here you can see a map of the Persian Empire at its height during the reign of the Emperor Darius. So why are we beginning in Persia if our goal is to talk about Egypt? So this is a period when empires rise, they expand, and then they collapse and are conquered again. And sometimes this only takes, a few generations. But these empires are bigger than anything we've seen before. And thanks to different kinds of historical sources, we sometimes know more about them. So in this case, the Persians were one such empire that rise to power in the mid-6th century BC, and they absorbed huge amounts of territory in the Middle East, the Mediterranean, going into Central Asia, and Egypt becomes part of the Persian Empire. So we have to look at Persia in order to make sense of what Egypt is going through. So things have really changed since our last class, when Egypt was the empire that conquered other places. Egypt has gone through a great decline. I'm sure Dr. Cummings talked about how empires collapsed at the end of the Bronze Age. And Egypt survived in more or less intact, but it lost its imperial holdings, and it was ruled frequently by foreign dynasties. We have a series of Libyan rulers, we have a series of Nubian rulers, and so it's able to be conquered by whatever the big power of the day is. So in fact, it's conquered by the Persians. So a little bit about the Persians. We have a great historical source to tell us more about the Persians in a way that makes sense to us than we do about other empires or kingdoms. We have the histories of Herodotus. So the histories of Herodotus were written in a way that is considered to be our understanding of history. So when we looked at all those sources about the pharaohs, we were looking at inscriptions, sometimes letters, but nothing that we would consider to be actual history. Occasionally we had a pharaoh speaking, saying what he wanted people to think about the past, but no one stepping back and looking objectively or trying to be objective about past events. Herodotus is really the first person to do that. So he's actually known as the father of history. And he is writing about a series of wars between the Greek city-states and the Persian Empire. And his goal is basically to explain why the Greek city-states, which were so much smaller, were able to withstand invasions by this huge empire. And so that's a genuine historical question. And in order to answer that, he says, well, we have to look at all aspects. So first, we have to look at why the Persian Empire became so powerful. And he tells it in a way that we would consider to be narrative history. Like, he writes a lot of great stories. So in the process, that's how we learn about the Persian Empire. Now, when I said he's objective, I meant he's trying to not aggrandize himself. He's not really objective because he thinks the Persians are barbarians and the Greeks are amazing. And so it's not, completely factual and without his bias, but he's trying to relay all the information that he knows. So from him, we know about the earliest kings of Persia. Cyrus is really the first famous king of Persia. Basically, it was a small area. Today, it would be about southwestern Iran. And they were just a vassal kingdom of the larger Median Empire. But they end up conquering first the Medes, then the Lydians, the Babylonians. Cyrus's successor, Cambyses, invades Egypt and incorporates it into the Persian Empire. And then Cambyses and his successor, Darius, they continue conquering. So we get this huge empire. So that means that Egypt, for the first time, it's still Egypt, but it's part of something bigger. And it's no longer governed by a pharaoh of just Egypt. It's governed by a Persian emperor. So Egypt becomes, in this period, what is known as a satrapy. A satrapy is a regional subunit of the Persian Empire. It's the way that the Persian emperor figured out how to control all of this. Because if you are just one man and you're governing from Persepolis and you're trying to control all this territory, well, of course, they're all going to rebel unless you have soldiers stationed everywhere all the time. And that was pretty much the ancient way of ruling conquered areas, but it doesn't work when you conquer this much territory. So the emperors created satrapies, these regional units. Egypt was one, and then they would appoint a satrap as the head of a satrapy. And the satrap was like a governor, and he would answer to the emperor, but he would do all the on-the-ground work. Now, once Egypt became a satrap, it's no longer independent. But it's not really a terrible situation to be in. The Persians were fairly lenient rulers. For one thing, they believed in religious freedom, which was not really a valued concept most of the time in the ancient world. But the Persians were fine with that. They didn't try and impose religious beliefs on their various conquered peoples. So local religious traditions were maintained, priests remained in power, Egyptian gods were worshipped. Probably the famous example of this is when the Emperor Cyrus actually frees all the exiled Judeans that are in Babylon and sends them all back, and he is considered to be sort of this great hero. He's even heralded as the Messiah for a while for having done that, and they were the same with the Egyptians. They also understood that the more local people they had working in the satrapies, the better. So the actual satrap himself would be an emissary from Persia, but everybody else in the government would be local. They'd be Egyptian. And it's the best way to prevent rebellion, is to try and keep people happy. The Persians were also very innovative, prosperous people, and they shared a lot of their traditions and new ideas and creativity with the Egyptians. So for one thing, they introduced the camel to Egypt. There hadn't been a camel before this. They bring it over from Bactria, which is roughly Afghanistan today. So they introduced the camel. They introduced currency. The Persians had actually taken the idea of coins from the Lydians, and they conquered the Lydians and then just taken over the whole idea of currency and introduced it everywhere they conquered. So the idea of silver coins, whose weight is basically secured by the monarch, that comes in with the Persians. So that's when we get Egyptian coins. They also do a lot of building with natural resources. They dig into a number of underground aquifers for more water sources, and they build sort of the ancient Suez Canal between the Nile and the Gulf of Suez. It's not the modern one, but they built the first one, and there's an inscription where it's from the Emperor Darius, and he says, I, a Persian, with my Persians, seized Egypt. I gave orders to dig a canal from the river that is in Egypt, the Nile is its name, to the bitter river that flows from Persia. I am Darius the First. So pretty clear statement about his intention. So Egypt actually did pretty well under the Persians. However, because they now share the fate of the Persians, when the Persians are doing amazing, then the Egyptians are doing amazing. When the Persians are caught up in foreign struggles, that means that Egypt is drawn into that. So Egypt basically shares the fate of the Persians in the 4th century BC, when Darius III, the last of the really great Dariuses, he's sort of the least and the last of the great Dariuses, he becomes entangled with the ambitions of 2 kings of Macedon, Philip II and Alexander III, who's known as Alexander the Great. And when those 2 kings end up fighting with the Persian emperor, then Egypt is drawn into that, and Egypt will eventually be conquered along with the entire Persian Empire by Alexander the Great. And that is going to switch everything from the language to the legal system to the political system. So because of that, we're going to switch focus and go to this kingdom of Macedon. Sometimes it's Macedonia, Macedon, it's roughly where Macedonia is today. So we don't really know what Philip II looked like. The gold one is an ancient coin. It still dates to the Roman period, so it's not remotely close to his lifetime, but it shows an older bearded ruler, which he was, so we know that much. The other image is a reconstruction based on a body that possibly is Philip's. There's a lot of possibles. So there were royal graves that were excavated, and they're dated to 4th century royal family of the Macedon kings. There's a limited number of kings, but there's a number of members of the royal family. So it's the same conundrum with, is this body Akhenaten or Smenkhare, or who are all these people? He's somebody important, but there's debate over whether he might be Philip, but he might be. He might not be, but he might be. We do know that Philip lost an eye, and so based on that knowledge and the reconstruction, that is a possible artist rendering of Philip II. Now, we also know that he was covered in battle scars, and he died in his mid-40s. So, whatever he looked like, he was a true warrior king. So, why are we talking about Philip and Alexander? They are two of the people who really shape history. Like, they absolutely change history. When you study history, we talk about how a lot of times it's not just one person who makes all the changes. It's trends, it's ideas, it's groups of people acting all together. It's frequently hard to pinpoint just one person who completely changes everything. Occasionally you can, Churchill, Napoleon, you can come up with some people. But Philip and Alexander were definitely those people. Alexander is the more famous one. That is because during his lifetime, he conquers the entire Persian Empire and beyond. And in doing so, reshaped the whole Middle East, Mediterranean, Central Asia, really for all time. The languages they speak, the cities they have are because of him. So he's more famous. But the reason he had the resources to do it was because of his father. Because Philip is the one who transforms the kingdom of Macedon and makes it into a kingdom that is able to create a successful general like Alexander. So Macedon is basically, I'll go back here. No, it's actually not on this, but it's to the north of Greece. It is, there we have Alexander's Brine. There it is, up there. You can see at the very top left. It is not really part of the Greek city-states like Athens and Sparta and Thebes or Corinth. It doesn't share in those traditions, even though it's technically Greek. They speak a Greek language. They consider themselves Greek and they have similar gods, but it's more like a rugged border territory. It would almost be like northern Scotland to southern England, during the Middle Ages or the early modern period, or even like I don't know if any of you watch Outlander, but if you think of the difference between the English and then the Northern Scots, that would be sort of like the Macedonians versus the more southerly Greeks that we're more familiar with. It did not have any of the sort of, democracy or theater or philosophy or anything we associate with the Greek city-states. It was a very rural, very underpopulated kingdom. It was basically feudal in structure. So there was always a king. There were a number of noblemen who hunted and fought. And when the king wanted to go to war, he called on these noblemen and they conscripted a bunch of peasants, who just kind of had to come so they weren't killed. And that's how they would fight. They were usually caught in between wars with the Illyrians and other groups to the north beyond the Danube, and their more sophisticated Greek neighbors to the south. So it was a monarchy as far back as we have records for. It was ruled by the House of Argead, and all of those kings claimed descent from Heracles, half mortal, half god, which is not unusual for a number of Greek monarchies to claim descent in some ways from Heracles. All of the kings married multiple queens, which tended to lead to multiple heirs, and there was no tradition of eldest son to eldest son, so that meant that any royal man had the possibility of inheriting the throne. And so because of that, there was a ton of infighting. Kings had very short lifespans. They were usually assassinated or murdered or died in a horrible accident, usually at the hands of one of their close relatives, or they died while they were hunting or in battle. So they were they were a bloodthirsty kind. And I've given you a list of them. So Philip II, he's second to last. He is the son of Amantis III. And as you can see, several of his brothers ruled before him. So he was not necessarily intended to be the heir, which is part of why his story is really interesting. When his father died, his elder brother Alexander becomes the king, and Alexander is involved in all of these different wars, and he ends up becoming involved in a war with Thebes, which is a Greek city-state. And as part of brokering various deals, he sends his younger brother Philip to Thebes as a royal hostage, which we think of hostages and we think of, terrifying scenarios, like people getting held in banks or on planes. Royal hostages in the ancient world were completely different. They were like honored guests who were meant to ensure the goodwill of the kingdom they represented. So they were treated very well. The Greeks have this tradition of xenia, guest friendship. So you had to treat your guest as if they were your brother, not your Macedonian brother that you would kill, but like your brother that you would love and give nice things to. And so Philip, what?
Same thing.
Yeah, well, with you and your sister, yes. So Philip was treated incredibly well in Thebes. He lived at the house of a nobleman, and he was about 12 when he was sent there, so he spent much of his formative years in a Greek city-state, which was definitely more sophisticated and more luxurious than Macedon was. And while he was there, he was fascinated in particular by their military. The Greeks had very intriguing, entirely unique military organization. For one thing, they didn't conscript their peasants to do their fighting for them. They had hoplite armies where citizens were the soldiers, and if you were a citizen and you were a soldier, that was a high honor and a high rank. And they fought in particular formations like a phalanx that were really unbeatable in battle, but also emphasized everybody's equality. So everybody kind of, marched in this big, like, solid square, as opposed to, send in a whole bunch of peasants and see who gets killed and who's left standing. And then the wealthy guys on horseback get to go. And so Philip observed that, and he saw how incredibly successful hoplite warfare was. And, he stored that up for future reference, because even though he was an honored guest, probably figured he'd have to be fighting against them at some point. So he spends his formative years in Thebes. While he is there, a lot of things happen over in Macedon. Basically, all of his brothers get killed. His eldest brother, who is king, gets stabbed during a ritual hunting dance that warriors would perform once a year. And he was accidentally stabbed. Seems like a terrible idea, and it seems like people were regularly stabbed during that. And then there's an invasion. There's a pretender. His younger brother is declared king, but he's too young, so there's a regent. The regent is killed. His younger brother is then killed. So basically nobody is left, and Philip ends up going back to become king, which he does. And while he's king in Macedon, he takes with him his experience of all those years in Thebes, and he makes some incredible transformations to his kingdom. For one thing, he introduces hoplite style warfare. Now, hoplite warfare is based on citizenship, which Macedonians didn't have, but what Philip does is he takes the general foot soldiers, like the conscripted peasants, and he elevates them. He creates a status for them. They're called the pazaratoi, the foot companions to the king. So basically being a soldier becomes an important thing, not just something you're forced to do. But he also keeps the tradition of mounted noble warriors. He introduces some new weapons, including a really long pike. He introduces a lot of military innovations that build up the Macedonian army and turn it into a powerhouse. Now, who is he going to fight? Well, the Greeks, who better? So he admired them so much that he really wanted to lead them. And to do that, he kind of had to conquer them. How could he do this? Well, of course, he has all these, he's built up his army. But the Greek city-states at this point are actually weakened from a lot of infighting, a series of wars known as the Peloponnesian Wars that basically destroyed the strength of all of their great city-states like Athens and Sparta. So they were kind of more easily able to be conquered. Why is Philip conquering the Greeks? His real desire is not actually the Greeks. It's the Persians. He wants to conquer the Greeks in order to unite them with the Macedonians in order to launch a full-scale invasion on the Persians. His dream is to conquer the Persian Empire. So this is all a prelude to that. And he is very clear about that. So of course, he has resistance among the Greek city-states who don't want to be ruled by him, but he also has supporters. They don't all see him as a foreign conqueror. Some of them see him as, a leader who will help them continue a great mission, which is to conquer the Persians. So Philip has that in mind. He also has a lot of issues at home. So he spent most of his life fighting in the field. He led his men on foot, on horseback. He was in the fray of every battle. That's how, he loses an eye. He's covered in scars. But even when he was at home, he really didn't get to relax. He had a personal life full of rivals and factions. And much of that was because Macedonian kings married multiple queens all at one time. Now, this does not seem to have been a tradition for regular Macedonian men, specifically kings. And they married queens as part of their foreign policy, like to create alliances, which we're all familiar with from, Middle Ages, things like that. But you want more than one alliance, so you have to marry more than one queen. So that's just the way it worked. So we know of about 8 women that he married, but royal women are only mentioned in sources if there's something really important that they did, like they were the mother of a child that then becomes important. So we could have had more queens that simply didn't survive in the sources. And I gave you a list of the queens. You'll notice that they're all from elsewhere, with the exception of the last one. They're all from nearby kingdoms like Epirus or Greek city-states like Thessaly. So they're all to help him strengthen his kingdom. And they're actual queens. They're not concubines. Now, his first wife, who is an Illyrian, so she's north of Macedonia, she's the mother of a daughter, Kanane, who will be important later on, so I'll have you to remember her. His second wife, Phileena of Thessaly, gives birth to a son named Philip Aridius, who seems to have had something wrong with him. The sources aren't clear. Probably he had a major physical disability that would have prevented him from riding into battle, or some kind of mental disability, because he was never considered as a ruler. Thank you. And now it's his fifth wife, though. That's the interesting one of the interesting ones. She is Olympias. She is the daughter of the king of Epirus, and she is Alexander the Great's mother. Now, everything we know about Olympias comes from sources that were written, in many cases, hundreds of years after she died and her son died. So all of those historians who are writing about her are well aware that she is the mother of Alexander the Great. So everything they write about her has to be, understood that way, because everything they say is basically about how her whole life, beginning with her marriage, her consummation of her marriage, the conception of her son, all of that is just filled with portents indicating that this is a particularly special birth and will be a special child. But one of the sources is Plutarch. He's writing over 400 years later. So we can't really take this as actual biography, more how people came to view Alexander. So for one thing, we hear that before her wedding night to Philip, she dreamt that a thunderbolt fell on top of her and burst into flames and then disappeared, but didn't burn her. But it's still pretty remarkable. And that her husband came in to visit her, and he found a snake coiled up next to her, and he was terrified. So he went and consulted an oracle, like, why was there this coiled up snake? And the oracle, actually the oracle of Delphi, who was showing me pictures earlier. The oracle Delphi says, well, you are going to lose an eye because you spied on a god at rest. And, he does lose an eye. The idea being that, the snake was actually a god who was, the real father of Alexander. So there's all these sort of portents to indicate that Alexander has a divine father. On the day that he was born, apparently, the temple of Artemis at the city of Ephesus, which is in Asia Minor, which would have been part of the Persian Empire, burst into flames while Olympias goes into labor. So all of the soothsayers say something has been born this night that will set fire to all of Asia. So none of this probably happened, but it shows the kind of import people gave to these events later. Because Philip presumably thought he was Alexander's father, because he seems to have favored him as his heir from early on. He ensured that he was taught in the arts of war, the arts of philosophy. He's extremely well educated. But again, there's no system of eldest son to eldest son. So Alexander is the favored child. That doesn't mean he is absolutely going to be the heir no matter what. So we know this because at one point he falls very distinctly out of favor, and his whether or not he will inherit is questioned. So this happens at Philip's last wedding. He marries a last wife named Cleopatra. Unlike all of his other wives, she was the daughter of a Macedonian, so she was not a foreign princess. She's actually the niece and the ward of a general Attalus, who was one of Philip's friends. And that is how you can see, I'm sure everyone is like, oh, Cleopatra. Cleopatra is actually a Macedonian royal name. That's how it will eventually get to Egypt, because Alexander will conquer it, and so they will take on Macedonian names. But Cleopatra was a popular name for royal women. Olympias and Philip had another child, Alexander's sister, who was confusingly also named Cleopatra. Philip marries Cleopatra, and the wedding is a horrible disaster. The wives are not actually allowed, which seems to make sense, given that, his wives are still alive. But Macedonian weddings are just for men. So men lay on couches and just get really, really drunk. So more like a bachelor party. They just skip the whole wedding ceremony. And, you can imagine warriors, wine, massive egos, massive ambitions, goes splendidly. So Attalus, who is the uncle and guardian of Cleopatra, raises a toast to this marriage and says, at last, you're going to have a legitimate heir born entirely of Macedonian blood, at which point Alexander is furious because he is the heir and he is legitimate. And he gets up and he challenges Attalus and insults him. He's like, how dare you insult me? I'm going to be the next king. And Philip basically gets up and is like, how dare you insult my guest and future father-in-law? But he is so drunk that he slurs his words and he's trying to charge to his son, and he trips over a couch and falls. And Alexander is like, well, that's your king. You really want him making decisions for you? And so, typical family wedding. And afterwards, Alexander is sent away in disgrace by Philip, and he ends up going to Epirus, where his mother is from, and he brings his mother with her. So, there's a possibility that, maybe he wouldn't have become king if Cleopatra had had children who had grown up. Who knows? However, she does have children. She has 2 children, but they're still quite young. Only a few years later, Philip dies unexpectedly. Now, this actually happens at another wedding, which he should have just known to not go to any weddings at this point. But this is the wedding of his daughter, another Cleopatra. Cleopatra, who is Alexander's full sister. So this wedding is to her maternal uncle, who is the king of Epirus. And that is not completely common, but it's not considered entirely unusual when royal families are involved and kingdoms are at stake. And it's actually seen possibly as a way to appease Olympias, because her daughter is now being married to her brother, but also to a king, which is a big deal. So there's this huge wedding, and it's held at a feast in honor of the 12 Olympian gods. So ambassadors and people come from everywhere. There is a huge crowd, and there's a big procession. The Greeks like to have statues of their gods in procession, so do the Egyptians. So they would be carrying representations of these Olympian gods, and then the bride is nowhere in sight. Neither is the groom. It's really all about Philip. The culmination of this wedding is when he shows up and sort of appears in this theater and everybody applauds him. And he does, and he's completely unguarded because he is a warrior. So, he knows how to take care of himself. And one of his royal retinue takes a dagger that is hidden under his cloak and rushes up and stabs him. And he dies. Now, what in the world? Why did this happen? So the sources are so complicated, and it just seems to have to do with all of these insane soap opera feuds that are going on at the Macedonian court. The very short answer is he was angry at Philip because Philip did not support him in a feud he was having with Attalus, who was basically Philip's father-in-law. And Philip didn't want to get involved. And it seems like Olympias and Alexander, while they didn't say assassinate Philip, they were sort of like, encouraging his anger and, saying, yes, you should be angry. That was awful. To the point where he rushes up and stabs him. He he escapes. There's sort of a slapstick moment where he trips over a decoration from the procession. He is caught by the rest of the retinue, and he is crucified as a deterrent. Although you can't really see the situation coming up again. And because this has happened, and, Philip really had not expected to die, and, we have this young warrior son who is right there. He is supported by all the nobles, and so Alexander becomes king. And as king, he basically takes on his father's quest, and he begins to conquer. He continues this war with the Persians, but as you can see from this map, he keeps going. So he fights with the emperor of Persia, who is Darius III. And this is a long, complicated, involved war that I'm not going to get into, but he is eventually successful, but he keeps going and he conquers not just, the Persian heartland, but all the Persian territories, which includes going into Egypt, which is, how we get to Egypt, basically. Now, Alexander in Egypt is really quite fascinating. He does not come in just as a conqueror. He comes in wanting to be an Egyptian leader. This was part of his general ruling tactic. He tried to adopt some of the customs of areas where he conquered in order to make himself more palatable. So when he finally makes it to the Persian emperor's palace, and he will stand on the balcony and show himself to the crowds, he adopts Persian dress, which is, like luxurious robes, and his Macedonian warriors are apparently horrified because they consider this to be very, effeminate, and, you're supposed to be wearing, like leather and, be in your saddle and not wear like, long drapey velvets. So they're sort of horrified by this, and then he takes perfumed baths and everything. But, he's trying to show himself as a Persian emperor. And he does the same thing in Egypt. So, move forward really quick. When he portrays himself on, Egyptian walls, he has his name rendered in hieroglyphs in a cartouche. So a cartouche is that long oval that you see. That is not in our Egyptian names, you can probably tell. It's a French name. It's from the cartridges that Napoleon's men used when they were fighting in Egypt. And when they saw this, when they were in Egypt, they called it a cartouche, and that name has just stuck. But that's how Egyptian kings would write their names, in the oval. And so he's doing the exact same thing. He also builds a temple to Amun and various manifestations of Amun in Egypt at Luxor, a traditional temple complex. And he portrays himself looking, pretty darn Egyptian. That's him holding the cups that he's giving to Amun Min, who's a fusion of two gods, Min, who obviously is a fertility god, and Amun, who, as we talked about, is a royal god. And you can see that there's the hieroglyphs. We've also got Greek letters carved in there as well. So it's an interesting fusion of cultures. Some of the inscriptions that are written on this temple very much indicate that he is portraying himself as an Egyptian ruler. So the translation here, the renovation of the monument is what the king of Upper and Lower Egypt, lord of the two lands, chosen of Ra and beloved of Amun, beloved of Ra and chosen of Amun, son of Ra, lord of appearances, Alexander, has made for his father, Amun-Ra. So he is showing himself as a traditional king who would portray himself not just as lord of the two lands, but as the son of Amun-Ra. Now, Alexander also goes to seek out an oracle in the desert, and while he's in Egypt. And he does this because he has an important question. And so he finds this oracle. And the oracle is a very Greek thing to do. You don't want to go seek out an oracle. But in this case, he asks the oracle if all of the murderers of his father have been killed, indicating he thought, it was a wider conspiracy, which it probably was. We'll never get the full truth behind it. But he asks, have all the murderers of my father been found and dealt with? And the answer he gets, typically cryptic from an oracle, is, why would you ask such a thing? Your father was never murdered. Do you want to rephrase your question? And then he says, have all the murderers of Philip been dealt with? And the oracle says, yes. And you should probably go build a temple to Amun-Ra, hint, hint. He is, again, the son of a god. So that theme just reiterated. Now, it's reiterated through the sources, the legends build, but those legends probably started in his lifetime because the kinds of things that he accomplished were considered to be so unfathomable for any mortal to do. So people naturally thought he was at least partially immortal. And also, he is portraying himself as a king in places where people already associate kings with the divine. So those legends just keep multiplying, that he's he's half immortal. He also identifies very personally with Achilles from the Iliad, who is, in this case, Achilles' mother is immortal. But he always kind of talks about Achilles being his hero and how he identifies with Achilles. Now, as going back, you can see from this map, Egypt is not enough. He keeps going. He just keeps marching. He goes all the way into North Central Asia, up into Afghanistan. He goes all the way into, can show you, you can see, this is his conquest superimposed on a modern map. You can see he goes into the Indus River Valley, into Pakistan, and there we go, where he encounters elephants. And so you can see that's a coin that shows him wearing an elephant head. That was obviously designed by someone who has never seen an elephant before. But still, the idea is people are excited about the fact that he has elephants.
Looks like a snake.
Yeah,
Like below his ear.
people are working on, descriptions of elephants, like they know it's, this sort of massive beast with horns and ears. They're not quite sure how it works, but they know it's really amazing. This is an interesting image of Alexander. So this is actually from a floor mosaic in a house that survived in Pompeii. So you can see how it would have been. That's just projected on the floor, but that's like a reconstruction that portrays him in battle. So, Pompeii is like, centuries after Alexander, but it's based on a lost Greek original. It doesn't mean it's an exact portrait, but that we start to get a similarity of ideas in terms of how he looks and how he was portrayed. And he seems to have always portrayed himself like as youthful, unlike his descendants and unlike his father, he's not bearded. And that probably led to ideas of his, his immortality. On the other hand, he is immortal. He is not immortal. He is mortal. He is all too mortal. And when his troops, basically when they get to India, they refuse to go on. So this is a mixture of Greek and Macedonian troops, and they are very loyal to him because he has led them to great victory and great treasure and great spoils. But they've had it by the time they deal with the monsoons. They are done, and they basically say, we want to go home. And he's a good leader. Every source that we have tells stories about what a great leader he is, how he doesn't expect his troops to do things he wouldn't do himself, that he was very well respected. And he says, okay, well, let's go home. So you can see they turn back. However, they only make it as far as Babylon, where he's only 33 years old. He suddenly dies. Now, given the general lifespan of Macedonian kings, it's right that you would think he was assassinated, except that he doesn't seem to have been. It seems like he either got a minor wound that was infected or possibly malaria, or maybe he was weakened by malaria and couldn't fight off a wound, but it does seem to have been a fever. And he lay on his deathbed for a few days and then died. And even the ancient sources say people suspected poison, but there really was no basis for it. It seems like his luck had basically run out. So Alexander has now changed the world. He has reshaped the world, and now he's going to die. And what is going to happen with it? He didn't plan to die at that point, so he hasn't made plans for how this new world is going to go on. He doesn't have an heir. What is going to happen? Now, according to various ancient sources, as he lays dying, he tells his general Perdiccas, Perdiccas says, well, who are you leaving your kingdom to? And he says, to the strongest. And then he says, please, I want my friends to play funeral games for me. Now, this has a double meaning. So on the one hand, it's referring to what happens in the Iliad when Patroclus dies, who's Achilles' friend, and they play funeral games, meaning like they do chariot races and feats of strength and all sorts of things in celebration of the warrior's death. But it also probably has a more cynical meaning, which is that Alexander knows that the second he dies, his empire will be a free-for-all, and those funeral games will actually be wars that are fought over his lands. And that is truly prophetic, because that is exactly what happens. So there is no obvious heir. Alexander has now married 3 times. He actually married the daughter and the niece of the now deceased and conquered king of Persia at the same time in one ceremony in 324, along with several hundred of his soldiers and generals who all married Persian women at the same time. It was part of that cultural blending he liked. It was this giant mass marriage. And then when he was in Bactria, Bactria on the Oxus River, he marries the daughter of the king of Bactria, Roxanne. That's how that name, got into the general lexicon. And she is pregnant at the time of his death. She's heavily pregnant. Now, she gives birth shortly after he dies to a boy who is christened Alexander IV. But can an infant hold all of this? What happens is that everyone who is either related to Alexander or who has ever fought with him, all of his Macedonian generals, his leading soldiers, plus his siblings, his half-siblings, his mother, they all basically, soon as he's dead, they stake their claim. And there's about 50 years of incredibly and bloodthirsty, even for this period, bloodthirsty wars, assassinations, backstabbings, in which his generals, who were all Macedonian, and his family basically ally with each other and against each other and all try and kill each other. So his half-sister Kanane is married to the sort of mentally or physically disabled half-brother in an attempt to take over the kingdom. They're all assassinated. His mother attempts to lead troops in favor of Alexander IV, as does Roxanne. All of his generals, marry each other's daughters off, all in an effort, basically to control as much of this territory as possible. And for a little bit, and most of them die within. Let's see, by 320 BC. So, it's been about not like 15 years. Everyone who was ever related to him in any way has died either on the battlefield or been assassinated. That includes his son, who is now a teenager, his brother, his 2 half-sisters, his full sister, his mother, and all of his generals except for 3. And so those were indeed funeral games. But those 3 generals who survived end up holding on to their territory. And they end up, after all these years of infighting, dividing it into 3 giant kingdoms. So you can see here, there is the Antigonus, they're called the Antigone dynasty after Antigonus One-Eye, who's one of these characters. They rule kind of the Macedonian heartland. There is Seleucus, who rules much of the Persian and Central Asian conquest. And then there is Ptolemy, another Macedonian general, who gets Egypt and some of Syria and kind of that whole Levantine area. And those kingdoms are known as the successor states because they are the successors to Alexander's conquest. But they are their own entity. They are known as the successor states, but also the Hellenistic kingdoms. So Hellenic is the Greek word for Greek. Hellenistic is the Greek word for Greekish or Greek-like. These kingdoms are Greekish. They are not Greek. They're not ruled by Greeks, and they're not full of Greek people. However, they are ruled by Macedonian generals who speak Greek and who fight like Greeks and have Greek customs. So thus, the laws, the language, the rulership, all of that becomes Greek. So in Egypt, which we like Egypt a lot, we get the Ptolemaic dynasty. And Ptolemy, who had been a Macedonian general, now becomes king of Egypt. As you can see, he calls himself Ptolemy the First, and his wife is Berenike the First. As you can see, they're the kings of Egypt. They don't look all that Egyptian. They look very, very Greek. So that's what we mean by Hellenistic, and the language is now Greek. So the knowledge of Egyptian writing is beginning its long decline into being forgotten because it's being replaced entirely by Greek, which is the language of law and government and culture, in fact. These are their children, both of their children. One of the things that the Ptolemies kept up from Egypt, they got rid of a lot of things, but they did take on the brother-sister marriage deal. So Ptolemy II and Arsinoe. So you can see on the flip side of the coin of Arsinoe, the writing is in Greek. So official writing is now Greek as opposed to hieroglyphs. Had kind of evolved at this point, but it's certainly not Egyptian writing. Here they are on Greek coins. However, they don't strictly stay Greek, which is why they're Hellenistic. They also take on Egyptian customs, particularly when it suits them. And interestingly enough, this leads to, in part, a rise in the power of Egyptian royal women. So their queens are co-rulers, frequently because they are the sister as well as the wife, and they're Macedonian, they're not Egyptian, and the Macedonians had queens. They didn't have great wives. They had ruling women who fought for their children, who made decisions, and who interfered in court politics. So we cease having a king's great wife and a lot of concubines, and instead we have fairly powerful Egyptian queens, and we start to hear the term that would correspond to queen for the first time. It's a Greek word, basilisa, and so Arsinoe would be a basilisa as opposed to a great wife. Basilisa is just the feminine of basileus, which is Greek for great man. So these are the first technically Egyptian queens. So Cleopatra, the famous Cleopatra, is not a great wife. She is a basilisa. And I will say that, okay, I'm just going to go back here. For this last image of Ptolemy and Arsinoe, they are brother and sister and their husband and wife. That works on multiple levels, which is key to Hellenistic culture because they portray themselves as Apollo and Artemis, but they also portray themselves as Isis and Osiris. Why not? And so one of the really intriguing aspects of Hellenistic culture is the combination of everything, which is why when we get to the final famous Cleopatra, whom we're going to cover in a later class, she is Cleopatra. She speaks Egypt. She also has studied Egyptian. She portrays herself frequently as Aphrodite, but also as Isis. And actually, this is going to be the last image. This is Berenike II. So she is one of these basilisas. This was from a wine jug for pouring libations to the gods. She is portraying herself both as Aphrodite and as Isis. And okay, I lied. This is really the last image on the PowerPoint. This is encapsulated by this Greek plaque written in Greek letters. It's from they're all Ptolemies. This is Ptolemy the 4th and 5th, and he's dedicating this temple to Isis, Apollo, and Serapis. Isis, traditional Egyptian god; Apollo, traditional Greek god; and Serapis is actually a god he completely made up. Just because why not? They're already fusing all of these different religious traditions. So I believe that's all we have time for today. Now, as we go into Rome in the next few weeks, these successor kingdoms are going to be really important because you notice we haven't been talking about Rome. Rome is not remotely important when any of these things are going on. It's just like a bunch of farmer warriors over in Italy. None of these people have ever heard of the Romans. But as the Romans become powerful, they are eventually going to have to tackle, the great powers. And those great powers they will have to deal with and eventually conquer are, of course, these successor kingdoms. So, more on them next week. All right, thank you. Questions?
Okay, so I'm looking here. Philip II's last wife, Cleopatra. You got this note here. 2 young children who didn't survive the death of their father.
Oh, yes, I'm glad you brought that up. They were apparently murdered by Olympias as revenge.
Nice.
Yes.
When did Greek become Koine Greek?
I don't know off the top of my head.
Those inscriptions look more like classic.
So I believe it's during the Roman period, but I don't know an exact date, but I will look it up for you for next time. Yes.
Wasn't Alexander quite the swinger?
So
70s term.
yes, it's interesting. He has somehow gotten that modern day reputation, and it's interesting because in the ancient sources, they all emphasize the fact that unlike other kings, so all the sources written about him are Greek or Roman, and Greeks and Romans believed that kings were decadent, senators, they're different, emperors, they're different, but kings and emperors are barbarians and they're decadent and they can't control themselves. So every other king and emperor in any Greek or Roman source is always out of control sexually. Like they have mistresses, they have slaves, they have lovers of every sex and age, but they all emphasize that Alexander wasn't like that he was really focused on war, and he was focused on his vision, and that he was sort of notorious during his lifetime for not caring about sex, women or men, that he thought, and he told his generals, chastity along with modesty being controlled with food and drink were incredibly important to his military successes. There's all kinds of stories that, these, conquered, petty kings would present him with harems of nubile young virgins, and he'd be like, no, thank you, I'm good. And so he has that reputation today, but I think for the ancient world, he was not considered that. And you can look at really his marital status compared to his father's. He does have 3 wives, but 2 of them were completely political, they were entirely political. He marries them basically as a way to solidify his conquest of Persia. It's not clear that he ever lived with them or spent any time with them, and he leaves Persia immediately. So they may never have even consummated the marriage. And then his last marriage is to Roxana shortly before he dies. So he's kind of famous for not being interested in sex.
So the movie with Colin Farrell was all a bunch of crap.
Sorry?
So the movie was called Pharaoh as Alexander.
Yes, no, yeah, don't pay attention to Colin Farrell. Yes. Thank you very much. Okay, coin a Greek. Okay, it does become, okay, so it comes in use in the 4th century BC, and develops definitely during during the Hellenistic period and during the Roman period. But you're right about those inscriptions being classical. And one thing that was unique about the Ptolemies is, you've probably heard of the famous Library of Alexandria, so I'm glad you asked that because that brought that to mind. Ptolemy, the first one, decided that he wanted to make Alexandria, Alexander built a new capital city. He actually built a lot of cities named Alexandria, but the one in Egypt was the most famous, rather than take over, Thebes or Memphis or any of the older capital cities. And Ptolemy wants to make it a central, like a cultural center on par with Athens or Corinth or a place like that. And so he creates this huge library where there's supposed to be copies of, every Greek manuscript, ever. And most of them, were lost and, burned down in various fires and, destroyed in different invasions. But the Library of Alexandria during the Hellenistic period is really quite famous, as is the Museum of Alexandria, which is not remotely what we would consider to be a museum. It's not like a public place that has things in it you can look at. It's more like a university where scholars are meant to come, or more like a think tank. Scholars come and they're given sort of space and money to write and think and make discoveries. Other questions? Okay, well, I will hang out here for a few minutes if people have more questions. Otherwise, I will see you next week. Thank you again for coming.